Hello and welcome back to the Into the Continuum tutorial series. My name is John Dickinson. In the previous tutorial, we looked at adding shape layers, adding stock vector graphics using different fonts, and also adding a time displace effect to that, plus some particles. In this tutorial, I'm going to walk you through how I created the oozy dripping text, as well as using displacement effects like CCC Glass and BCC Displacement Map. So let's jump in. So this is where we finished at the end of part 4. And following that, we get this kind of ripple displacement and this drippy reveal where the original text appears to drip back onto the graphically treated text. And I thought this was a really fun way to get back to the original text. So let's break this all down. I'm going to go into FX and into text. And we'll start by looking at the text treatment. So we finished at this point on this text here. And at the next frame, we have the original text, but I've used BCC Charcoal Sketch to give us this really nice black and red look. And BCC Charcoal Sketch is one of the BCC Art Look presets. So that lasts for a few frames, and you can see the drips are starting to happen at the top. And then we jump to a different look again. So BCC Halftone and Grunge. BCC Halftone and BCC Grunge. And you can see that with BCC Grunge, once again, I've used that same Ralph Steadman ink splatter texture, and I've used the multiply blend mode. But I've also turned on chromatic aberration. And if you've watched the other tutorials, you'll know that we can use Prism or misalignment to create this kind of look. But it's nice to know that Grunge also has chromatic aberration built in. And we go from that look to the next look. And you can see I've really taken full advantage of the continuum effects. Here we've got the main effect, which is BCC Pin Art. And I follow that by BCC Tritone. And I've placed the After Effects matte choker before that just to choke the matte a little bit so that these pins didn't peek out from around the edges of the blue text. So I've just choked that down a little bit, which gives us that. So you can see if I just do that, you can see it's just choked that back. Then we apply the Pin Art and then the BCC Tritone. And after that, we go to wooden text. And to create the wooden text, I've used BCC Wooden Planks. But I have preceded that with the black and white effect because the wooden planks effect gave me kind of a blue look. So I decided just to make my text black and white. And that got rid of that blue cast that I was getting. Notice also on top of that, we've got our ink splotches. Just the Adobe stock ink splotches again. And that's using the soft light blend mode. And also our friend preserve transparency is checked so that we don't see the ink splotches on the background. And they're the 4 different treatments that I've given the text as it's being covered up by this gooey version of the original text. I wanted to try and fit as many different kind of looks in this section as I could before the text gets covered up again. And you only see each of these looks for a few frames, but I think it's quite effective. Just a nice combination of different looks. Okay, so now let's take a look at this drip reveal. I'm going to just go into drip reveal glass and dig right down into here. So we've got into the continuum title studio text. We just turn off the matte. So there's our text, and here's our drips. So if I turn that back on again, you can see that the drip composition is revealing that text by using an alpha matte. I double click the drips comp. Here's the drips. Now these drips are also from Adobe stock, and the file didn't quite match what I wanted, so I've masked it off. Let me just turn that mask off. Choose none. So there was a bunch of smaller drips, but I needed to create one longer drip. I'll turn that mask back on. So I've duplicated it, and I've just moved the mask around to create a longer version. And I needed more than just one little strip of drips. I needed black above that, so I've just used a black solid. And that will act as my matte in the other composition. So I come back to drip reveal, and using drips as the matte, just animating the position of that. You can see I've got position keyframes just to slide that down. And I did consider using masks to kind of offset the drips so that this didn't look just like a wipe, but it happens so quickly that I thought it was just extra work for not very much gain. So that's the drip reveal. Let's go back to drip reveal glass. So in here is where I've used the glass effect. This is CC glass, one of the standard effects in After Effects. And I've applied it a couple of different times. So let me just turn the one applied to the layer off and back on again. So that gives me that nice soft gloopy look. And I did play with the settings, and it wasn't giving me quite the puffy look that I wanted. So I actually ended up using an adjustment layer and applying CC glass again. So a second version. And you can see, especially on the O, check out the O. I really like the puffiness that applying that twice gave to me. It really closes up the hole in the O and really pushes these together nicely. And I wasn't getting that effect when I was just using one application of CC glass. And notice also that I've added a couple of keyframes, and these are for height. You can see I've animated the height, so it goes from 25 down to 0, because we have to go back to our original text before it starts to transition and the camera zooms back in. You may have noticed that there's also an expression on the top version, so I've linked the height of the top one to the height of the bottom. So just by grabbing the parent and link pick whip and just connecting that to height. So that way I've only got to use 2 keyframes. So pretty effective. Okay, so let's just twirl these up and press tab and come back into text. And you may notice a drop shadow underneath that. And I think the drop shadow makes a big difference to this. And I've used the same technique that I've shown in the previous tutorials, where I've used drop shadow with shadow only, and I've used the preserve transparency checkbox. Once again, not wanting to cast that shadow on the background. I've also used the overlay blend mode so that we didn't have the shadow being, too black. It actually adds a bit of color to that. If I just choose normal, it all goes quite black. But choosing overlay just adds a bit of variation to that. So let's go back to FX. And you can see there's not very much happening in here. Everything that's being done as far as the drips are concerned is all happening in the text comp. So we'll come into the main comp. And let's take a look at the drips that fall off of the text and also the splats on the floor. If we just come back a little bit, there's our drippy text, and you can see these drips are sort of coming from behind the text. And these are created using shape layers. Let me just solo these. And I'm just going to set my work area around that by pressing Ctrl-Alt-B, Command-Option-B on Mac. So they're slightly offset. I didn't want them all to appear at the same time and all to move at the same speed because it looks really fake. A little bit of offset goes a long way. Just press U you can see I've just keyframed the path. If we select the path of one of them, this one here, this is a good example of one. So just see it at the top. You can see it's quite stretched here. So it stretches out, and I probably could have stretched it a little bit more, but it happens so quickly. So maybe it's a little shorter at the beginning, and then it stretches out, and it picks up more and more volume until it starts to drip. But it happens so quickly, didn't think that was necessary. But I did feel that it should shorten as it comes down. You can see it changes shape. Comes down, and let me just zoom out a bit. It's quite long, and it does change shape. Gets a little bit thicker at the end, a little bit pointier at the top, just by adjusting the path. And then when it hits the floor, or the virtual floor, it just squishes a little bit, like that. And that's because it hits the Adobe stock splotches. We'll look at those in a moment. The treatment that I've done on the drips is just to add some CC glass. And this goes a long way to selling this. You can see without that, it's very flat. With CC glass, we get this nice volume and this nice specular reflection. So it was the same treatment for all three. Just turn these off and we can see everything. You may notice that when these drips start to appear, they actually appear behind the text. You can see them there. So I thought about having them in the front, but it was a bit harder to sort of sell them in the front because they'd have to really be really well nicely connected to this soft, oozy blue text in the front. And that would have taken a lot more work. But I thought putting them behind this text kind of made it feel as if the gloopiness is actually dripping behind as well. So I was happy with that. And I could live with that. So you could see they start there. They're probably in a little bit too early, but you can imagine the gloopiness is sort of dripping down behind as well. Over here as well. I mean, it only happens over a frame or two, so it's very hard to notice. So these drip down, and like I said, they're offset slightly in time, and then they hit the floor. And I thought, rather than disappearing, we should actually see some sort of splats. So for this, I've once again used the ink splotches. And notice that I've actually made these 3D layers and just rotated those to try to match the rotation of the seamless cyc. And you can see because they're 3D layers and we've animated the camera to do a slow zoom in, then they move with that camera movement. So when that drip hits, you can see that's where I've keyframed the shape. Then I've animated, let's just see which one it is. It's this one here. Just press U. I've animated the scale of that so it's slightly smaller. So the drip is losing volume that's being dispersed on the floor. And then when it hits the next frame, it scales up. So we get that plop, just like that. And once again, using CC glass, also with fill, because this is a black layer, gives that some specular highlight and a little bit of volume, and it really looks like liquid. And I've just matched the color of the fill to the color of the shape layer. So you can see that's really quite effective. Notice how with the shape layers, they're actually a little slower at the beginning, and then they pick up speed. Just take a look at this one here, and just look at the value graph. You can see we start out fairly slow, and it's just oozing down the back of the M, dripping down. And I guess the idea is that it's picking up that volume of water. So it's a little slower, and then when it gets heavy enough, it releases and picks up speed and then hits. And I think tweaking the value graph like this is worthwhile. Otherwise, you've got linear movement, and it isn't anywhere near as realistic. It looks particularly good on this one. If everything moved at the same speed as the wipe, and these all animated at the same time, all at the same speed, then it wouldn't look anywhere near as good. Okay, so now let's take a look at this displacement effect. So this one starts at about this point. Remember, I animated the shape layer rings, and I used a point force to blast out the particles in a ring shape. So I thought it might be really nice to add to that or enhance that by adding some displacement. And that's done using CC Glass and also the BCC Displacement Effect. This particular one is just glass. And for the glass bump map, I've chosen this layer here, Shockwave Map A. Let me just double click that. So this is the circle effect, After Effects circle effect, just animated out like that. So animating the radius, and importantly, feathering the inside. So you can see edges set to thickness. And if I twirl open feather, you can see I've feathered the inner edge a lot more than the outer edge. Definitely feathering the outer edge a little bit so we don't have that hard line. But the inner edge is important because you get that kind of tail, that sort of shockwave tail. Pressing Shift Escape to come back to the previous comp. So if I just turn off some of these above, let's see, these ones here. Come back a little bit. You can see how that's displacing the background and giving this nice specular highlight, which really makes it look 3D. Now I've used two of these. One that only affects these background layers, and one that affects the foreground and the background. And I've offset them slightly in time, just to give this kind of like a pond ripple effect. Let me turn on the next one. So there's a secondary one, and this is also using the same shockwave. Let's turn these layers back on. So you can see the one in the background only affects the cyc and the layers below the text and the particles. So this whole text treatment and these scribbles and these shape layers are kind of sandwiched in between. And there's one slight difference with the top one. It has BCC Displacement Map. If I just turn these both off and turn on glass, that certainly adds some displacement, but by using BCC Displacement Map with the same shockwave, that gives us even more displacement. So you can see how the ring for the particles is kind of working together with the displacement in glass. And it kind of looks like the displacement is pushing the particles out. You may have also noticed just a couple of Prism adjustment layers here. Let's turn those on. We talked about the Prism adjustment layers in the previous tutorials. These ones are on top of everything, so they're displacing everything below. Just to add the occasional one frame variation to this. And I kind of sprinkle these on at the very end of the animation. I usually end up adding way too many and deleting a whole bunch of them. We come through to the point where the text is fully revealed. And it zooms out. We have our cyc darkener, just a black solid. Just keyframed from 0 back up to 100, just to darken that background back down again as the lights turn off. That's also good because when we get to the last keyframe, we're basically on black, and that's where I reveal the Borisfx logo. And the Borisfx logo has just a range of different effects that we've already looked at, misalignment, prism, video glitch. There's also a bit of BCC LED in there. So basically using the techniques and effects that we've looked at in the previous tutorials. And here's the final look once again. So if you've made it to the end of this 5th tutorial, well done. I hope you understand how BCC Continuum can be used now in conjunction with After Effects default tools to create this really fun and detailed Into the Spiderverse inspired look. So thanks for watching, and be sure to visit borisfx.com to take a free trial of Continuum and to see more videos about all of the Borisfx products.